Throughout history, civilizations have risen in places where nature seemed generous. Rivers provided water, soil yielded crops, forests offered timber, but this relationship was never guaranteed to last. Environmental conditions that supported growth could shift, and when they did, the societies built upon them often struggled to adapt. The connection between environment and stability is not always obvious at first. A civilization might thrive for generations, its people confident in their systems and structures. But beneath that surface, subtle changes could be underway. Rainfall patterns might shift slightly. Temperatures could creep upward or downward. Soil might lose fertility after centuries of intensive farming. These changes did not announce themselves with sudden drama. They accumulated quietly, year after year, until their effects became impossible to ignore. Historians suggest that many ancient societies experienced decline not because of catastrophic events, but because their environments changed in ways that strained their capacity to respond. Evidence from tree rings, pollen samples, and sediment layers points to periods of drought, flooding, or temperature shifts that coincided with societal stress. These environmental pressures did not directly cause collapse, but they set in motion a chain of difficulties that proved hard to reverse. When harvests began to fail more frequently, food stores dwindled. Communities that had relied on predictable yields found themselves facing shortages. Trade networks that depended on surplus goods weakened. People who had lived in one place for generations sometimes migrated in search of better conditions, placing pressure on neighboring regions. Administrative systems designed for stability struggled to manage scarcity. Research points to a common pattern. Environmental stress often exposed weaknesses in how a civilization was organized. A society built around intensive agriculture might lack the flexibility to shift to different food sources. Cities designed to house large populations became difficult to sustain when supply systems faltered. Institutions that had worked well in favorable conditions sometimes proved rigid when adaptation was needed. The Maya civilization offers one example. In the lowlands of Central America, they built cities, developed sophisticated writing, and sustained populations through advanced farming techniques. But evidence indicates that prolonged droughts during the 8th and 9th centuries placed enormous strain on their agricultural systems. Crop failures likely disrupted food distribution. Political centers that had depended on steady resources found their authority weakening. Over time, many cities were gradually abandoned. This was not a sudden collapse, but a long erosion of the systems that had held society together. Similarly, historians studying the Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia have noted a correlation between its decline and a severe drought around 4,000 years ago. The empire had been built on irrigated agriculture, and when water sources became unreliable, food production suffered. Social order, which had depended on the state's ability to manage resources, began to fracture. People moved away from urban centers. The administrative structures that had governed the region lost their cohesion. In both cases, environmental change did not act alone. It interacted with existing social and economic structures, amplifying vulnerabilities. A drought in a society with diverse food sources and flexible institutions might be weathered. But in a society highly specialized and dependent on specific conditions, the same drought could unravel carefully balanced systems. Climate was not the only environmental factor that mattered. Soil degradation played a significant role in many regions. Intensive farming, especially without crop rotation or adequate fallowing, gradually depleted nutrients. Land that had once been highly productive yielded less over time. Communities faced a choice: expand into new territory, intensify efforts on exhausted land, or reduce population. Each option carried risks and costs. Deforestation also weakened some civilizations. Trees were cut for building, fuel, and agriculture. But their removal changed local climates, reduced rainfall, increased erosion, and destabilized water cycles. In places like Easter Island, evidence suggests that the loss of forests contributed to ecological collapse, making it harder to sustain the population that had once thrived there. What becomes clear across these examples is that civilizations were not passive victims of nature. They shaped their environments, and those environments, in turn, shaped the possibilities available to them. When the relationship became unbalanced, when extraction exceeded regeneration, or when external conditions shifted beyond a society's ability to adjust, decline often followed. The process was rarely swift. Decline unfolded over decades, sometimes centuries. One generation might notice that harvests were slightly less reliable. The next might see more frequent shortages. Later generations inherited systems already under strain, with fewer resources and less flexibility. By the time the full extent of the problem became clear, reversing course was often difficult or impossible. Understanding this pattern helps explain why so many civilizations experienced similar trajectories despite being separated by time and geography. Environmental pressures, whether from climate shifts, resource depletion, or ecological imbalance, tested the resilience of social structures. Those that could adapt, diversify, and reorganize sometimes survived. Those that could not often faded, leaving behind ruins and records of what had once been. The interconnection between human activity and environmental response created feedback loops that were difficult to break. As populations grew, demand for resources increased. More land was cleared, more water was diverted, more timber was harvested. These activities generated short-term benefits, but often carried long-term costs that were not immediately apparent. By the time ecological damage became visible, societies had already committed to patterns of living that depended on continued extraction. Changing course required not just technical solutions, but fundamental shifts in how communities organized themselves, distributed resources, and planned for future generations. The lesson is not that nature determines fate, but that stability depends on maintaining a sustainable relationship with the environment. Civilizations that overextended, that relied too heavily on conditions they assumed would never change, found themselves vulnerable when those conditions shifted. Decline was the result of accumulated pressures, of small stresses compounding over time, of systems losing the capacity to adjust. History remains incomplete. We cannot know every detail of how these societies experienced their decline, but the evidence we do have suggests a consistent theme. Environmental change, interacting with inflexible institutions and strained resources, gradually eroded the foundations upon which civilizations were built. Collapse was not a single moment, but the end of a long process, one that began with subtle shifts and ended with the abandonment of cities, the dissolution of networks, and the quiet fading of once thriving cultures.